Tansi, Anin Bujo, Watie, Kwekwe, Sego, Washte. I am honored to be on the ancestral lands of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe. We want to say thank you for allowing us to convene in your unceded, unsurrendered territory. We say, Miigwech Kinaskumitnan. And I also want to acknowledge all of you, the survivors, for having the courage and the bravery to tell your stories. Because without your story, there is no truth. And without your truth, there is no reconciliation. And we hold you up in high esteem for your courage. I want to say, Miigwech, thank you. I just want to also acknowledge that I am the grandson of a residential school survivor, and my aunts are also IRS survivors, and I think of them as we gather here this morning. And I also want to make an acknowledgement to Kimberly Murray for her warrior spirit. What she has done has been very exhaustive and comprehensive, and she has told those stories in a way that will impact this nation. I want to say thank you, Kimberly Murray. And we could not do this without the survivors. We could not do this without your courage, and I want to say thank you, Miigwech.
Hamadakiapi, Dawawashtewi Amakiapi, Chantewashtena Pechiusapi. My name is Melissa Hotai. I'm a counselor for the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation in what is now southern Manitoba. I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting here today on the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, and acknowledge you all for being here for this important gathering. I dedicate this presentation to my Ina, my mother, and all the residential school survivors that attended the residential schools across Canada. I'm pleased to be here to co-present along with MKO Grand Chief Settee, and to just start by, again, introducing a little bit about, if you don't know where we're located on the map here. Our Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, which we call Wipazoka Wakba in our language, means Saskatoon River, is located on where you see it's 55 kilometers west of the city of Brandon, which falls within our traditional territory. We are one of 8 Dakota nations on the northern, what we call our northern traditional territories of what is now Canada. And our Dakota and Lakota and Nakota people were separated by the imposition of the border and the creation of 2 countries. And I'll let you speak to the MKO.
Thank you, Opera. MKO consists of 26 First Nations, and there are at least 73,000 First Nation people in our territory, and we continue to represent and advocate and lobby for our treaty rights holders. Although we are not treaty rights holders, we continue to ensure that the treaties that are in our territory are advocated for, treaties 4, 5, 6, and 10.
So our Dakota Nation's work on finding missing children began in 2012 with leadership of the day and our Brandon Indian Residential School Coordinator, Catherine Nichols. This was before there was funding, and so we had to be very creative in how we advanced the work of finding the children. In the 1990s, the land on which the Brandon Indian Residential School was situated was transferred to our First Nation. For a bit of background, I'm just going to share a little bit about, if you're not familiar with the school, it was operated between 1895 and 1972, and children from all across the country attended this. Many were from the MKO First Nations. With this understanding, we have established a partnership with MKO, and we know that there are over 40 children from 8 of the MKO First Nations that are buried in the cemeteries. There are 2 known cemeteries that are at this school. One is located on the north, owned by the Brandon Research Center, and the second is on the land to the south of the school that is privately owned and is now called the Turtle Crossing Campground. And we have also identified a possible third burial on a portion of the land that we own. From the archival records, there are 113 deaths associated with the BIRS and 104 potential graves from the geophysical forensic surveys. The cemetery located in the campground has been destroyed twice, once during the development under ownership of the City of Brandon, and a second time with private land ownership. Several efforts have been made over the years to gain access to search this site located on the private lands. To date, a geophysical survey was completed and confirmed the cemetery location and identified 56 potential unmarked graves. However, the survey was unable to define the boundaries of the cemetery. There have been several attempts to gain access to and finalize the work that needs to happen. There have also been several meetings with the city, the landowner, the province, and the federal government to advocate for the protection of the cemetery and the return of these lands. Moving forward, we understood the importance of having a partnership with MKO. We as the custodial First Nation and MKO as the culturally affiliated First Nations. This partnership was established and supported by the Chiefs in Assembly in 2023. And these partnerships are important for joint advocacy and connecting families and communities. We believe in the importance of creating safe spaces for them to make decisions on how to continue to search for and honor their children, and we must support them in meaningful ways. So this, oh sorry, that's me. So the reason, and I'm sharing the background because it led to one of the reasons for hosting the Protecting the Ancestors Conference earlier this year was to address these issues that you see on the screen. First and foremost was about the lack of federal legislation. And some of the key issues there for this was to ensure access to and protection of our sacred sites, for the ancestors that are held in institutions, for land back, and for lack of funding to maintain the cemetery sites, and also to address the lack of clear jurisdiction. There is also a lack of strategy for repatriation of ancestors' remains and belongings, and some of the key issues underneath this include the lack of funding to do this work. We are very dependent on the museums, the universities, and the institutions' goodwill to work with us, and the large responsibility and costs that it puts on the communities, and the lack of engagement with the Indigenous communities. So that transitions to the conference itself, and I want to speak to the logo. The conference was held over 3 days in February of this year in Winnipeg. And again, the purpose was to explore the development of a national law to protect our ancestors and their belongings in Canada. Our logo is a powerful and meaningful representation of the conference's mission to honor, protect, and repatriate the memory, spirit, and remains of the children who did not return home from these institutions. It serves as a reminder of the importance of cherishing the bond between mother and child, acknowledging the beauty of life, and recognizing our responsibility to protect and honor all living beings. Through its powerful imagery, our logo serves as a call to action to continue the important work of preserving the memory of our ancestors and ensuring that their stories are never forgotten.
As mentioned, we had the privilege of hosting the Protecting Our Ancestors Conference along with the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, and many of you were there, and you've seen the illustrations that were created as we were facilitating the discussions. And these illustrations speak to some of the aspects that were heard from the participants, the experts, stakeholders, and community members at the conference. And each day the conference was focused on one theme. And the illustrator took these themes and also to develop a picture, a scenario, an illustration of what was being discussed by the speakers, and they spoke very powerfully, and they spoke their truth in a way that was so respectful. And one of the key elements that came out of that discussion on the first day was Dr. Jamie LaValle of the University of Saskatchewan, who spoke about the importance of First Nations developing their own heritage stewardship laws to protect ancestors in unmarked burials or ancestors held hostage to institutions such as museums and universities. And MKO and Sioux Valley Dakota Nation concur and agree with the recommendation that we need to establish First Nation heritage stewardship laws, and we must work together so that they coincide with a national legislation to protect our ancestral remains and also the belongings that belong to them. So on the same day, David Russell highlighted the number of former residential school sites in Canada located on reserve and off reserve. And he concluded by identifying that 98 of these former institutions were off reserve. And that is why it is important for us to move in such a fashion that we must strive and work hard to ensure that those sites are protected. And we will continue to speak loud and clear to ensure that the remains of our ancestors are protected all across this nation. And this is a national issue, and we continue to address the governments to ensure that these sites are protected. And on the second day, we also started learning about repatriation programs established in the United States and New Zealand. Shannon O'Loughlin of the Association on American Indian Affairs spoke about the limitations of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. So we looked at that as a model that we can utilize, but without the limitation that NAGPRA has. And also the New Zealand government also funded a program of repatriation, Karanga Aotearoa, from Dr. Jamie Metzger, who came all the way from New Zealand to present. So this program exists in New Zealand, but it is not what our Indigenous people deserve, because there are limitations to these programs. So what we're advocating for is a more comprehensive and also a more solid process to ensure that our ancestors are protected. And so on the third day, we decided, after all the discussions were had, how do we move forward? And even yesterday, when the final report was released, we asked ourselves, what do we do now? What is the plan forward? And I'm here to assert and agree with Kimberly Murray's vision that the 42 calls for action, we will stand beside her and we will stand together, ensure that they are implemented. And that's the path forward for our people. And we continue to work together, MKO and Sioux Valley, so that there's immediate provincial protection of former residential school sites and all sites where the remains and belongings of our ancestors are located. So in the United States, as soon as there's a discovery of unmarked graves, those sites are immediately protected. In Canada, there is no legislation or law that exists, but we are advocating here there must be a law. There must be legislation to make sure our ancestors are protected. And then we call on Canada to enter into a co-development process with Indigenous peoples to develop and enact a NAGPRA-like law in Canada without limitations. So that's what we're pushing for as an organization and also a nation that we're working with. We will continue to speak loudly and clearly, and we have been doing this since 2021. As soon as the 215 unmarked graves were found in Kamloops, we immediately wrote to the government to ensure that there is a process, an investigation, because these are crimes against humanity. And also, these are crime scenes. We must never forget that these are crime scenes, and we must protect our ancestors to ensure that those sites are given the protection that they deserve.
So while we wait for the co-development of a national law, we can still call on governments to protect sacred sites locally. For example, MKO and Sioux Valley Dakota Nation have jointly advocated for solution-driven approaches by proposing the application of existing legislation to achieve our shared goals. MKO and Sioux Valley have been requesting Manitoba to take immediate steps to protect this, and this can be done by initiating our joint four-step process, which is what you see on the screen here. Step 1 is for Manitoba to protect the site through immediate designation as a heritage site, pursuant to Section 2 of the Manitoba Heritage Resources Act. Step 2 is to enter into an agreement with the custodial and culturally affiliated First Nations to ensure that First Nations conclusively have custody and control of the remains of the children and of the site and have authority to make decisions regarding disposition. Step 3 is for Manitoba to acquire the site pursuant to Section 22A of the Heritage Resources Act. And Step 4 is for Manitoba to enter into agreement pursuant to Section 22B of the Act to transfer the site to the custody and control of the custodial and culturally affiliated First Nations. However, this has yet to happen. And we emphasize that this request falls in line with UNDRIP Article 12, the TRC calls to actions number 75 and 76, Manitoba's Path to Reconciliation Act, findings in the Senate Committee report called Honoring the Children Who Never Came Home, Truth, Education and Reconciliation, and yesterday's OSI final report and Canada's obligations, calling for Canada to amend or enact legislation to establish an Indigenous burial site designation. With regards to immediate provincial, protection, Sioux Valley and MKO are happy to see that that was a recommendation that's come forth and a call on Canada, an obligation on Canada to amend or enact legislation to establish an Indigenous burial site designation. As a result of the Turtle Crossing campground issue that we have been involved in, and alongside the survivors of the affected families of the Brandon Indian Residential School, we are well aware that the use of existing provincial legislation does not support Indigenous peoples to protect their ancestors wherever they may be. For example, as the Manitoba Heritage Resources Act is currently written, private landowners can contest the Heritage Minister's decision and appeal the Heritage Site designation. So we proposed an amendment to this Heritage Act. And so what does that mean? We want to add a definition for Indigenous heritage site, which means a site which is known to or is reasonably believed to contain human remains or heritage object associated with the former Indian residential school, or is a site, including a site that may contain human remains or heritage objects that is claimed by an Indigenous people in Manitoba to be culturally affiliated with an Indigenous people in Manitoba. And we also want to add a part that where the minister designates an Indigenous heritage site under this part, the Lieutenant Governor in Council may confirm the designation without objection or appeal of this part. To say this another way, private landowners cannot contest that residential school cemeteries do not exist and cannot appeal the decision. Oh, it's not to your site. Yeah.
So therefore, we surmise that there's a national strategy that is needed to be able to protect our ancestors, and also we also need to develop a process similar to NAGPRA, because as I said earlier, there's a federal law that protects and returns Native American ancestral remains and cultural belongings. That's a law that exists there. And the key part of that is that they establish the cultural affiliation of each of these remains and which nation they belong to, and also the custody and the controlled treatment and repatriation or disposition of these remains solely belong to the First Nations and Native American people that have those sites identified. So it is important and it is incumbent upon Canada that they enter into a co-development process with Indigenous nations to enact a law similar to NAGPRA, without the limitations I mentioned, to conclusively protect ancestral remains and belongings wherever they are located and are suspected to be located. So recently, we became aware of Bill C-391, an Indigenous Human Remains and Cultural Property Repatriation Act. And this act went through some readings, but it did not see the light of day because it was, I guess it lacked the political will of government, but also I think that it was the case of denialism, that the governments do not really want to admit what really happened to our people, so that bill never was passed. So that's why today we have to have a national strategy to ensure that there's laws and legislation to protect our people. And when they were young and going to school, there was nobody to protect them, but we have to protect them. We have to protect them. So at our conference, which many of you attended, our people and the people that came and spoke to us, they recommended that we create such a legislation, a co-process with the government, so that we can address the following matters that are very critical to all of us. The rights and affiliations aspect, for example, who has the right and authority to make decisions for our ancestors? We do, only we do, and we will do that. Protection and custody, for example, MKO and Sioux Valley want to see all the Indian residential school sites and burial grounds associated with it, with IRS schools, to be protected and in the custody of Indigenous nations in Canada. And the treatment of care, for example, how can we ensure our ancestors and their belongings are taken care of while they are housed in colonial institutions? For example, the University of Manitoba has a place in their university where they have human remains of our ancestors. And I know that there are people in there that work in the university that go and do ceremonies and make sure that they're taken care of, but not all institutions do that. Some are just sitting in boxes and piles, really not giving the respect that they're due. So we want to make sure that there's legislation to protect those and that there's funding provided that we can do that. And also the legal and international aspects are consideration that national legislation supports repatriation of ancestors located outside of Canada, because I know there's many of our ancestors that are not within the confines of our country, and we must have a process to bring them back to their homeland. So these are the things that we are working on, and we continue to advocate to make sure that we create legislation and law, and we'll continue to ensure until we see such a law exist in Canada.
So to summarize, the Protecting Our Ancestors was, again, a national gathering, again, to discuss those issues related to the lack of protection of our sacred sites and the repatriation of ancestors and cultural items. Again, he just shared the important aspects that were highlighted, and again, we call for immediate provincial protection and the development of a national NAGPRA law and strategy. Without these laws, there is no protection to sacred sites and no path forward for repatriation, which opens the door for everything we just heard about, open the door for denialism, for the vandalism that's occurring, and then intentional neglect by private landowners. So thank you for, that's my part of my presentation. I pass it over to Grand Chief.
In closure, we all agree today here that Canada holds a continuing and persisting duty and responsibility for the children pursuant to Article 9124 of the British North America Act of 1867. It was Canada's decision to remove these children from their homes and to put them in residential schools, and also to strip them of their language, identity, and their culture. It was all under the hands of legislation and orders in council enacted by Parliament. So they are responsible for correcting all these wrongs that they have done. So in the spirit of reconciliation in Canada, we must replace these shameful colonial frameworks that do not clearly recognize that First Nation and Indigenous people have and must have custody, control, and decision-making authority to our ancestors and all of our relations. So let this law and legislation be enacted in Canada. We will continue to push until it exists. Egusani.